Thank you all so much for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity to always talk about stuff I love, and that's the case today. So since 1985, my colleagues and I have been in the business of replicating the LEAP model of early intervention for young kids with autism. We've done that in about 100 preschool settings across about 20 states. And I want to share some of that longitudinal experience as well as some more narrow experiences related to a specific study that we did a couple of years ago. So I've advertised some lessons learned. You ready for the first one? Here it is. If you're planning on getting your hands dirty at any point in time, you might as well go ahead and just jump in the mud pie. And that's kind of, historically speaking, what we did with LEAP. And so LEAP was built on a series of about 36 single-subject design studies, all conducted in criterion environments, all interventions implemented by the people that we ultimately wanted to impact in the long term. I'll assure you that there are some negatives associated with that. But I'm tempted, oh hell, I'm going to go ahead and do it. I'm going to quote my favorite philosopher, Moms Mabley. And Moms said the following: if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. And my memory functions aren't that good anymore, but I remember the response from the audience when the question was asked earlier today, how many people are getting evidence-based practices? You remember that? Well, anyhow, that's lesson number one. Take it or leave it. So what is it that we have been replicating since 1985? Well, this is listed as key intervention components, but now I have a new term. I'm going to call these kernels of LEAP. I try to adapt to my environment. Some people say I'm under audience reinforcement control, but I think that's a little too negative. So here's some features of LEAP that distinguish it, in many cases, not all, distinguish it from other early intervention services for young kids with autism. We spent a lot of time, thanks to Howard as well, figuring out how to teach typically developing peers to facilitate the social and communicative skills of their classmates with autism. We spend very little time assessing kids, coming up with functional goals and objectives. We essentially ask adult family members what they would like their kids to be doing. And if at all possible, we try to deliver on that. We also embed hundreds of learning opportunities for children throughout the day and embed those within typical preschool routines: arrival, circle, spilling juice, those typical routines. We also implement in the service of generalization, not because we're committed to this service delivery model, but we're committed to solving the fundamental generalization issue that challenges all kids on the spectrum, and that's stimulus response generalization. And that's why we employ a transdisciplinary model of service delivery. Well, what does that mean on the ground? It means on the ground, in a high-fidelity LEAP program, if you walked into the program, you observed what adults did, you couldn't tell by their interactions with each other, by their interactions with children, by their interactions with adult family members, what their discipline was. That's, to us, an operational definition of transdisciplinary. We also collect a good amount of data. Unlike a lot of my colleagues, not for self-congratulatory purposes, but data that allows us to know in a timely fashion that we've made mistakes. Those of you in the autism business know there's a high probability that your first best idea about how to teach behavior X is not going to be correct. And if you do not have data systems in place that allow you immediate feedback on children's performance, there's a high probability that you'll be wasting your time and theirs. It is early intervention, and the window is fairly narrow. Can't afford to continue making mistakes over the long haul. Unlike most name brand programs, LEAP is not a service delivery system based upon the delivery of just one form of instruction. Never made any sense to me. The heterogeneity in this population is too great to rely on one model. So these are not all of the evidence-based practices that we use. It's just representative. So we use picture exchange communication system primarily not as a language acquisition device, but as a problem behavior prevention one while kids are acquiring language to be able to express their wants and needs, desires, etc. We use pivotal response treatment, errorless learning, incidental teaching, peer-mediated intervention. How do we make a decision? Well, we try to be as data-based as possible. And if you look at the data on each of these interventions, I believe that you will come to the conclusion that they work better in some developmental domains than others. And all things being equal, that's how we make initial clinical decisions as to what to use with individual kids. That's a little bit about LEAP as a preschool intervention, but that's just half of our model. The other thing that we do is we spend time, as much as family members think that they need, in folks' homes, trying to make routines more manageable for them. Our goal is to not turn parents into therapists, but to make family life more easy, more happy, more normalized. So we deliver a highly structured, manualized parent skill training curriculum, but we do it in settings that parents say they want help in, and we teach skills not in the order that's in our curriculum, but in the order that makes sense as applied to that particular setting. And the staff just hope and pray that parents don't say, "We need help at bedtime." But occasionally prayer doesn't work, and people's hours are a little bit different. So in 1985 it was, shortly after launching efforts to replicate LEAP, we were desperately in need of a fidelity measure. And we ask ourselves, well, what are we going to do here, folks? And here's the strategy that we used. I don't know if it's good. I don't know if it's bad. You decide for your own purposes. But here's what we did. We went back to all those precedent single case design, mostly multiple baseline across setting and multiple baseline across participant studies. And we asked the question, can we turn the independent variables in those studies into readily measurable, reliable coaching system indicators that allow us the best chance to say whether or not folks are at fidelity in terms of implementing the LEAP model. And the QPI, the Quality Program Indicators, is about a 50-item scale. It measures 8 different kinds of dimensions of implementation of LEAP. Just to give you a better idea, let's drill down a little bit and look specifically at the promoting social interaction component. So it has 6 indicators, and each of these indicators is measured on a 5-point scale from minimally implemented to fully implemented. And so, for example, capitalize on the presence of typically developing peers. Well, are you setting up a situation where peer models are readily available? We have a specific system that we call peer buddies, and we look to see that that's implemented across settings that it's appropriate to be implemented in, so on and so forth. I want to have you look at some fidelity data from the QPI. So in 2007, we launched a clustered randomized controlled trial in which we did the following. We identified 50 preschool sites across the US that currently were using an inclusive model of service delivery for young kids with autism, and who also had the capacity and the willingness to implement our parent skill training component. And making that selection, we randomly assigned half of those classrooms to get our intervention manuals only, and half the classrooms to get the intervention manuals plus 25 days of on-site coaching to Fidelity across a 2-year period. And I would call your attention to this mean implementation row across intervention classes and comparison classes. And as you can see at start, people are implementing, a way to read that, on average, about 25% of LEAP practices. After 1 year, about 12 days of intensive coaching, the intervention classes are implementing about half of what we'd like them to implement. The comparison classes are doing a little bit more as a function of reading. Now, I have to tell you that the publisher of our intervention manual was not doing backflips at this point in time in terms of, but anyhow, that's the way that goes. Not a huge surprise to most of you, I'm guessing. At the end of year 2, you can see that the intervention classes were implementing a high level of LEAP practices, about 87% of them, comparison classes 38%. That distinction that Alan Kasdan has preached about and talked about for years and years is what he calls treatment differentiation. And it's seldom measured and seldom seen in treatment studies. But I would argue is an important dimension. It's not just sufficient, I think, to say the comparison got a business as usual, but often that's what you hear. End of story. Let me also give you lesson 2. Are you ready for this one? This surprised us. There's not a stepwise linear relationship between getting to Fidelity and child outcome growth and development. There's a threshold phenomena. That is to say, if you're doing 70% of LEAP, there's a high probability that you won't see differential responding by children or by adult family members. It takes a high level of implementation. And that has profound implications for how you nurture people in the adoption process, does it not? Because most people think that if I start doing this, life is going to get better. I'm going to see an effect. I'm going to feel in the short term that this is the correct investment. And our data show that it takes a while of plugging along and a high degree of Fidelity implementation to reach behavioral effects. Well, in fact, you do get to some good effects. So here's a highly condensed version of outcomes for kids in this particular randomized trial. So the deltas essentially represent different scores from a pretest to a post-test that was conducted approximately 2 years later. But if you actually looked at intervention time, the distance is only 14 months from the pretest, on average, from the pretest to the post-test. So a way to read this is the Childhood Autism Rating Scale, which is a fairly crude, but we used it because we'd used it for the last 25 years, and we wanted to compare study to study. We thought that was worth the cost of being criticized for continuing to use the CARS. A way to read that is that children had about 6 less, if you will, indicators of autism symptomology after intervention. The comparison kids, 2.8. And our difference is that we analyze with MANOVA is the differences between those deltas. And as you see, going down the list, the effect sizes range from moderate to whopping. So a way to read, for example, the PLS-4, which most of you are familiar with. So kids on average in the full replication classrooms made 18.5 months developmental gain over a 14-month period. Kids in the comparison group made 9.4 months developmental gain over 14 months. So we think perhaps we have something that's worthy of continuing to replicate. What I think is important to share with you, more so than the differential effects in that study, are some correlations that were significant and some correlations that weren't. So in this chart, what we're showing is the correlation between the quality program indicator, our fidelity measure, at the end of year 2, and each outcome index gain score for both groups. And if you know about correlations in the behavioral sciences, these are really big. They're not trivial. And notice for each outcome for both groups, it makes a profound difference how much of LEAP was being implemented. And it makes me think, oh, I hate to say this in public too, because you'll think I'm not a hard-nosed scientist, but anyhow. But it makes me rethink how we should define intervention groups. The way we usually define them is how we initially assign them at the beginning. But they don't always fall out that way. If you recall that chart when I showed you the fidelity data, one of the classrooms in the comparison group was at 92% fidelity. Are they a comparison now, or are they something different? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide and ponder late at night. It also makes a difference whether people feel as if this process of coaching and the practices that they are being coached on make a difference. In 1995, my colleague Frank Kohler and I looked at primarily the business literature, because that's where most of the literature is on adoption. And businesses adopt all the time and really quickly, and they rock and roll. And they go with the data. Sometimes they don't go with the data, but they make decisions all the time. And here's what we found when we looked at dimensions that influenced adoption. And we have adopted this for our purposes, and these are data from that randomized study. So folks rate these dimensions on a 1 to 5 scale, 1 representing this is not applied at all, to 5, yeah, this is great. And let me tell you about a little bit how we defined each of these dimensions. So applied means that I can use it today. That was the definition. Once you tell me how to do this, there's not a lead time between that event, my having a cognitive understanding of a procedure, and being able to implement it. Effective means perhaps not what you think. Effective means, in this definition, that I can apply it across context. So I can use this as an intervention for language acquisition at circle time, for social interaction development at free play, for developing functional use of objects at snack time. Flexible, in this definition, applies to the range of kids that I feel like this is applicable to, and so on and so forth. And as you see, we get really high fidelity scores, social validity scores. But here's lesson number 3. You couldn't possibly guess it because I've hidden the facts from you. But here's lesson number 3. Timing is everything. If you ask people to fill out a social validity scale in year 1, they hate everything. Pretty much. But at the end of year 2, when they've reached that F word, that fidelity, they feel really different about that. And so the timing of these assessments is crucial for a variety of different purposes. And it doesn't mean that that first assessment is invalid at all. It should dictate your level of support for people in a process that sometimes is difficult, on a variety of different levels, difficult. Especially when you think back to the first chart I showed you, people in some classes were doing 3% of LEAP when they started. We essentially asked people to do everything different, everything. It's not like adding a strategy to your toolbox. It's like throwing your toolbox in the shed and starting all over again for many of these folks. Here's some other correlations that you might find interesting. Teacher experience and prior training was not related to outcomes. You might think differently. Child characteristics at start were not related to outcomes. And trust me, we assessed everything imaginable. The correlation approaches 0, which means that 2 things are true, perhaps more than 2, but some kids who are doing pretty good in baseline are not good responders, and some kids who look pretty slam developmentally do great. Fidelity turns out to be the sole powerful predictor in our model. So, kind of looking back over the last 30 years of this work, we've had the opportunity to do some critical informant interviews with folks. And we've been able to tap into programs who've been running at a high degree of effectiveness for almost 3 decades, and some not. And here's our best guess at what sustains fidelity, at least with this program in these kinds of educational settings. And the first, not necessarily in order of importance, but the first piece of it is the commitment of the primary administrator, that is the person in charge of purse strings, to the model, as opposed to the next newest shiny thing. And by that I mean that that primary administrator was presented with the next newest shiny thing, and his or her response was something like this: well, I'd like to see the data on that. And, well, that data looks pretty good. And do they have any evidence that that process can be replicated outside of UC Santa Barbara or UC San Francisco or UC Boulder or wherever? So it's not that they automatically rejected the next new shiny thing. And in the autism business, that's probably twice every hour if you're on the internet in terms of the next new shiny thing. It's not that they offhand rejected it, but they were careful consumers, if you will. We also have identified another key factor, or if you will, a behavior of primary administrators, and that is they have used the QPI now as their supervisory system. Instead of going into a classroom willy-nilly, which is how it usually happens, and observing without a protocol, and then writing up impressions about, yeah, Patty's a pretty good teacher today. Didn't see anybody getting hurt. Looks good to me. They used this data system. Here's what they also did. They created a personnel ladder within their organization to reinforce high fidelity use. So retention and pay increases were tied to the QPI. Stability of staff. Well, in the early intervention business, staff turnover really rapidly. Forget about the issue of implementation and implementation science. It's just a horrific experience for organizations, for families, for kids. And it's not so much that programs that maintained over time didn't experience staff turnover. It's that they had mechanisms in place to recover. The most common one being that they assigned new staff to experienced folks in the program with a specific goal of mentoring them on items on the QPI in which they scored low in terms of initial performance. And finally, the other kind of fuzzy variable, it's hard to really pin down, had a number of different iterations, but it looked to us like this was pretty significant, and that is for programs that maintained over many, many years, LEAP was the headline of the organization. That's how they advertised themselves. They weren't just an autism program that does some inclusionary stuff, but this is what we do. We're going to ride this horse. This is our banner. This is our headline. Here's some things that we're a little surprised about. We can't find an association between service systems that are well-resourced and maintaining fidelity over time. We did some replications in the wealthiest school district in the United States. It's in the Northeast. That's all I'll tell you. They didn't last very long, but resources, incredible. We've had a number of other iterations of that. We've also had replications in some of the poorest, impoverished places on the planet, and they're doing just fine. Thank you. We thought that programs that got hit with a lot of traumatic events would lose their momentum. Traumatic events like, a new administration comes into power in state government and decides to, slash all preschool services. That happens more often than you might think. But that doesn't seem to be necessarily related to sustainability. And the real surprise was we couldn't find any association between the size of organizational change and sustainability. And by that I mean we've worked in some school districts where we've replicated LEAP in dozens of settings. You would think that would kind of like meet the permeability sort of test in terms of influencing the organization, but it doesn't seem to predict for us. So let me just end real quickly with some things I wish I would have known 30 years ago. And we've gotten this information, again, from key informant interviews, and I would invite you to think about whether the answers to these questions could be your research agenda, because these are the questions that people ask us most often in their decision to adopt, as well as in the process of learning the strategies. When will I see an effect? We have a lot of data on what the size of our effect are, but no one has ever said to us, "We love your effect sizes, they're so huge." What they want to know is, when is this going to take effect? And if you ask parents what they want, what's the answer that they want? When is my kid going to get better? It's a when question, and it has a profound impact on the designs that we use, how frequently we collect data, right? Is the effect going to be better than business as usual? We've talked about that a lot over the last couple of days. People want to know what the cost is at all kinds of different levels, dollars, the degree of change that's going to be required in my organization. How much supervision am I going to have to take on that's different than what I'm doing now? What's the data collection requirement that's over and above or different than where we are now? How will I know that I'm at Fidelity? And perhaps more important in terms of long-term sustainability, what can I do to stay there? Because most people already know, because as been pointed out, they've adopted other things in the past, and drift has clearly occurred. And I don't know the answer to this, but I struggle with this mightily. People often want to know, do I start big or small? My organization has 35 classrooms. Do I go all in? Do I do a test? Do I do a natural experiment, Start with 5 and see how it goes, see how the consumers feel about it, see how the implementers feel about it. I don't know the answer to that, but it's a question that people have. And here's another one. Can I talk to other folks who are further along the path? This kind of notion, Albert Bandura is one of my heroes, and I think his most amazing accomplishment is this notion of the proximate model, which is to say, if you want somebody to emulate something, that pair of individuals who are most like one another, perceive each other to be most like one another, that's where the power is. And frankly, we've done a lousy job up to now making those connections for people, but I'm committed to doing better on that. And finally, or next to last, I bet you all get this a lot. Our fill in the blank, our clients, our providers, our families, our whomever are more needy than yours. And how can this work with them? Everybody feels like they are in the deepest hole that can possibly exist, right? And being able to respond to that honestly is really important. And I don't know how to do that other than having replicated Leap in some deep, dark holes. And finally, this sounds like more work. How do I get my providers to buy in? So my time's up. Thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to hearing the rest of the panel.